And, you know, Moses is giving them a lot of commandments from God here. The focus of the lesson today has to do a little bit with the vulnerable in our community, right? So just read along with me in verse 21 of chapter 22. It says, "You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him." Why? Well, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. "You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with a sword." That's a way of stating, I'm going to bring warfare into your community, and many of your people will die, so to speak. He said, "Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless." This is an eye for an eye, a tooth for the tooth kind of law here going on. "If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like money lenders to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, it is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious." Now, when I was going over this text, and this is, you know, I sort of follow the Sunday school, or what's coming up in the Sunday school. This is not a text I would pick to preach from. And usually those texts I need to hear the most, right? You know. Now, there's a number of people that were mentioned in here. You had the stranger, or resident alien, or foreigner, right? You had the widows. You had the fatherless, or the orphans. And the poor. In fact, the next text in Leviticus will cover the poor too. And you know, as I'm going through this, and I'm thinking about this, the thing that struck me is how different, if these Israelites did what God told them to do, how different that would be from all the other gods. Because all the other gods were distant and often not involved, and certainly capricious. They were kind of moody, right? You could never tell how they were going to react. And oftentimes when you approach that God, it was more like a bribing process, right? You know, how do I bribe this God into giving me what I want? But God is revealing himself, and he's saying something about himself through the laws he gave the Israelites. What is God like, anyway? And did any of you ever struggle with that concept? What is God like? Remember Harold telling us, right? Sunday school, that, you know, when he was a kid, he'd heard things like, if you do that, you're going to go to hell. Well, you know, you hear that enough, you know. It sort of colors what you think God is like. He is just waiting, boy. He's just waiting for you to mess up so he can put his finger down and crush you. I mean, have we ever had that concept of God before? And is he like that? Martin Luther has always been kind of fascinating to me. Erwin Lutzer said this: that Luther sought the monastery because he wanted to save his soul. I mean, he wanted his soul to be saved, but the problem was, the question is how? And he said this: in those days it was believed that yes, you were saved by grace, but you have to make yourself worthy of grace. Now, how do you do that? You have to, see, that's in the back of his mind. How do I make myself worthy of God to save me? And so he threw himself into the disciplines of the church to excess, really. Even confession. I think I read that he spent 6 hours in confession. How would you like to be the confessor, listening to 6 hours of sins that Luther's trying to come up with? He fasted sometimes so long that people thought he was going to die. I mean, he was a serious monk. There's other things he did too. A couple months before his death, he wrote this: though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he was placated, or appeased or satisfied, if you will, by my satisfaction. He went on to write this: I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punished sinners. This is a monk, right? This is a guy, and he's giving himself completely over to it. As if indeed it is not enough that miserable sinners, eternally lost through original sin, are crushed by every kind of calamity and by the law of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, without having God add pain to pain by the gospel, and also by the gospel threatening us with his righteousness and his wrath. Michael Reeves from Union Seminary said this: as a young monk, Martin Luther hated God. He quotes him again: I did not love God. Yes, I hated the righteous God. He wrote, he counted, like countless others who doubted whether they had made themselves worthy of heaven, Luther shook with fear at the thought of how God might judge him. Until, of course, he began to understand that the gospel is not a message of fear and judgment, but of good news and great joy. It was as if his whole world had flipped inside out. God, he saw, is not asking us to earn his love and acceptance in any way. God's righteousness is something he shares with us as a gift. These are the words that caught me, and it's just kind of a refrain that runs through me every time I think of this concept. He says this: acceptance before God, forgiveness, and peace, and I might add love, with him can be received by a simple faith and trust. And here, said Luther ecstatically, I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered into paradise itself through open gates. Luther had joined a monastery to do good works for God, but he came to see it is not God in heaven who needs our good works. It is people on earth. I like that. And you know, it's kind of, there's so many people, I think, out there today who think they're pleasing God by their good works. But the focus is people need good works. You know, we have this Christmas tree, we do OCC, you know, and this Christmas tree, I meant to say something, so I'll say it now because I forgot. But, you know, this is a ministry in our community. And we're touching them, and we're touching the people they touch when we do something for them. And so they're asking us to buy mostly diapers, I think, but there's some few other things in there. But you know, God doesn't need your good works. He's not impressed with our good works. But people out there need our good works, right? I thought that was just an interesting thought. It really kind of jarred my way of thinking a little bit. Made me think a little bit differently, just a little bit. What does it mean when God says, be holy because I am holy? What does that mean? Does it mean, you know, spend a little bit more time judging your neighbor or talking about how bad everybody is? Is that what that means? Well, certainly, it does mean refrain yourself from the sins of the world. I mean, as, you know, with his help and his power, certainly means that. But I think being holy, as God is holy, means being compassionate as God is compassionate. Being loving and being other people serving, if I can put it that way. Because that's the way God is. And when you think about it, you come to the first point. The first point is quite simple. Is that God's people are supposed to reveal God's nature, or I should say what God's nature is like. I mean, when you go out there every day, sometimes, and you've heard this expression before, you're the only Bible people will read. And if you claim to be a Christian and they look at you and they're saying, well, what is this God like that they serve? What is the evidence that they have? In our text today, we ran into strangers, the resident aliens. Well, we certainly have a lot of resident aliens today, don't we? And we can get all wrapped up in the politics of it, and we can get all wrapped up in everything else. But here's what the God told the Israelites: don't mistreat them or oppress them. Anyway, don't squeeze them. Which is interesting, because apparently God knew that as God is giving them this new land, that it's going to be in their power to choose. It's going to be in their power to do so. They're going to have the power to oppress. And they're going to have the power to mistreat if they so choose. But he says, don't do it. So the resident alien was supposed to come in to that land and see, you know, the God these Israelites serve is different than anything I've ever met before. Do not mistreat them or treat them wrongly. Do not oppress or press or crush. And then he says, don't afflict the widow. Afflict means this. It means to afflict. You can use that word, or oppress, or humiliate, even rape. And he switches over to poor. And he says, you know, and here's the way it worked back then. You know, if you loaned money, typically it was a charitable action. You would do it, and you wouldn't charge any extra for it, because the poor didn't have the resources to pay that extra. And so God is very interested in the vulnerable among us. And we know that one of the vulnerables among us today is the unborn child. They really have no voice but us. But we got to be very careful how we speak for them too. Because remember, we should be concerned about those who are believing the other side too. Right? And we should be concerned about them. I mean, sounds pretty good, right? You know, that the wife or the mother should have say so, should have the choice, should have the freedom to choose for her own body. But of course that does leave a little problem about what about the unborn child? Does he have a choice? So these things are awfully messy, right? They're awfully messy. We should have compassion for both, and we should certainly weigh our words, because I think the media really gets a hold of it when we don't get that right. And it doesn't help the unborn child or anybody else for that. But make no mistake, God's people are supposed to reveal God in their actions, in their words. Now, since we are close to Christmas, and I thought about this little text, and I really like it, you tell me where it comes from. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob. Faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. In other words, I'm a pretty good man of business, too. I love how Marley answered. Business, cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. Mankind was my business. You know, I might spend more time at work, but work is not my business, nor is it yours if you belong to God. And I really believe this is true. Mankind is our business, charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence. He says we're all my business. The deals of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business, of my responsibility for having the gift of life, because my business should have been mankind. And in the end, that's true of all of us. Later on, when Scrooge is meeting these, well, it's a ghost of Christmas present, right? You know, the big fat king guy, you know, with a big rich robe and stuff. And if you recall, at least in the movie, he opens his robe and shows two children. And he explains to Scrooge who they are. He says, they are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, and this girl is want. Beware them both, and in all their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be replaced. And Scrooge says, have they no refuge? And sometimes we like to, like to kind of approach it. Aren't there government programs that can take care of these things? Are there no resources? But the ghost quotes his own words back to him. You remember what they were? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? The second point I'd like to say is when God's people obey God's commands, God's nature is revealed. When we obey God, His nature is revealed. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, again it's talking about the poor. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape in your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor. And there we go again, the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Again, the subject is the poor. He talks about corners. I think the rabbis said that they were supposed to leave a sixth of their crop in the field. So I don't know that that's particularly Bible, but it's rabbis anyway. We are to obey God. We are to trust Him enough to obey Him. And we are to obey Him from this place. And this is what you got to remember. We are to obey Him from a place of personal acceptance with God, of forgiveness with God, of having received the grace and the love and the mercy of God, of having that knowledge that God loves me now. Jesus Christ has died for my sins already. And I am trusting Him now. And whether I succeed or fail what I go out to do, it doesn't really take that away at all. Right? But we are to represent Him, and if we do it right, people will begin to see that God is holy, and by that, it means God is different. And people see that God is different when they see we're different. And if I could use another word, a little weird. Right? When we obey God, God reveals Himself further to us. When we obey God, others see we are marching to a different drum than the world. That's what happens when we obey God or follow God. I do like that word. You know, sometimes when people ask me, I say, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. So it sort of puts me in a different state of mind. Ron's quote today, which I did write down. Those who aren't following Jesus aren't His followers. Where do you think Jesus is today? Are you there with Him? I think you are, because you're here. Followers follow, and those who don't follow aren't followers. We obey God, as Tori says, by finding out what God wants us to do for the day and then do it wherever we find it. I keep on quoting that. Sometimes, maybe they'll seep in to me and to you as well. You are revealing to those who don't know or have not experienced or don't have a relationship with God something of who God is. This is how C.S. Lewis puts it. To have faith in Christ means, of course, trying to do all that He says. That's what it means. To have faith in Christ is trying to do all He says. There would be no sense in saying you trusted a person if you would not take his advice. Thus, if you really handed yourself over to Him, right? He's talking surrender talk. If you really handed yourself over to Him, it must follow that you are trying to obey Him. Now, I like what he says here. Hopefully this will help you. He says, but trying in a new way, a less worried way. Not doing things in order to be saved, but because He has begun to save you already. Not hoping to get to heaven as a reward for your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because a first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. Now in Ruth 2, you have a perfect illustration of this whole gleaning process. We are told there, starting in verse 1 of that chapter, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of This is one of those words when I'm reading them, it just sounds right, and then I don't practice it, so I come up here and I'm not sure it's going to come out right. Elimelech, let's go with that. And his name was Boaz. Now you've heard of Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go into the field and glean heads of grain. After him, in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now, if you remember, Naomi's a Jewish widow, right? Ruth is a Moabite, is, I guess, her daughter-in-law, even though her husband's passed as well. And she said to her, go, my daughter. And then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And when she happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech, now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servants, who is in charge of the reapers? Or he said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And so the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered him and said, it is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves, because this is part of their law, remember? This is part of their law. They're caring for the poor. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen to me, my daughter, will you not? Do not go and glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young woman. And let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessel and drink from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face and bowed down to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? All right, now consider what we have here. We have a foreigner. Resident alien means they're not from the place, but they're living there, right? She's poor. You got two of those things God is very concerned about. And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. Here's what kind of strikes me. Boaz is pretty impressed with this young girl. And, you know, the Hallmark love thing hasn't started yet in the story, right? Yeah. The whole, in fact, this is as far, you find out kind of later, this is not really on Boaz's mind at all, right? That was kind of a move by Ruth, as I recall. But here's a man of God, right? I mean, he is doing, this is during the time of Judges. Have you ever read Judges? There's some messed up things happening in the times of Judges. Here is a man of God who's doing God's will. And because he's doing God's will, God himself, his nature, is understood. You know, God says, I'm gracious. It's not the view people had of God typically. Right? And if you do what I command you, people will see. I'm gracious, I am compassionate. I'm kind, I want you. I want to pour my love out on people who come to me and put their trust in me. And I don't know about you, but I kind of have to remind myself of that some days. Right? This is who I am. And, you know, if you will obey me, and think of all the things Jesus told us to obey, love one another, right? Love your enemy. Love your enemy and people will know that you are weird. Right? You're holy, you're different. And they'll ask ask themselves, where did that come from? Whose drum are they marching to? Who are they obeying? You know, even if you mess up and you have to apologize to somebody, that in itself is a witness. Right? It is. You know, man, I did not represent God well there, and I need to go talk to that person and tell them that. That's a witness too. I have a final point, but I'm kind of making it now. Do you know that Jesus Christ is the complete revelation of God, who God is? Why? Because He is God. Number one. And He's God made flesh. And if you want to see what God is like, you look at His life. And Jesus told a story one time. He told a story of a son who wanted his father's inheritance kind of early. Right? This is from Luke 15. I really like my inheritance so I can go live like I want. And the father agreed. Now, I'm not sure that in culture that would have happened, or too often anyway, but it did in this case. And so the boy runs away and he goes and lives a wasteful kind of existence, right? Kind of like I did when I went to college. Right? And he just consumes the resources he has. Until he runs out, and then a famine hits, and then he sells himself to this guy, and nobody helps him a bit, and the guy has him feeding hogs, and the hogs are eating better than he is at this point, right? And then we are told he comes to himself, you know, this is not the way it is at my father's house. This is not the way it is back home. Even Dad's servants have food to spare at my father's house. This is kind of came to his senses. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go back. And I'll say, Dad, I've sinned against you and I've sinned against God. Which, by the way, he did. Right? And I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But he found something kind of weird happen when he went home. And he had this speech, and he's going to say it. But his father sees him from a long distance off. You remember that? From a long distance off. And then his father does something that is just not considered kosher in this society. He hikes up his gown, so to speak, his robe, right? And he runs. Old people didn't do that. Old people like me don't do that now for other reasons. He ran. And he was looking for this kid from a long way out. And that's the way God is. That's the way God, He's waiting for us to come back to Him. And sometimes people, they get themselves in pickles and they try to hide from God, and God respects that, but He's waiting, He's looking, and He's waiting for you to run to Him. Because that's who God is. That's who the creator of the heavens and earth is. That's who the God who spoke everything into existence is. And so the source that we come from, we have in the Bible a description of who God is, and we can know who God is. And when we honor God and when we obey God, others can know who He is too. Do we reflect His nature? And I think that's the essence of these kind of laws. What is your business in life anyway? Mankind's your business. I'll tell you what it is. I mean, Dickens had it right. And it wouldn't hurt every day to get up in the morning and say, God, by your grace and by the truth of your word, I am accepted by you. I am forgiven by you, and I have peace with you. I'm not in contention with you. I'm not in hostility with you. You know, I don't have enmity between you and I because of the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. I have these things. And furthermore, I know, and I know when I don't feel it, I know because you have revealed it, I know that you love me. Because you sent your only begotten Son to die for my sins. I know these things, whether I feel it or not. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to confess that every morning. Why? Because when you are centered in that God, and when you feel accepted, because that will come later, right? And when you feel loved, and when you feel forgiven, sometimes that's a hard one for us to accept, isn't it? When you have accepted all those things God said about you, you're going to be empowered to live for somebody else and not yourself. Because you know what? The Bible's not about self-love. It's about accepting love that's already there. It's a whole lot different than, say, try to convince you, Troy, that I'm lovable. But I can tell you on the authority of Jesus Christ, I am loved. Right? That's a different beast altogether. So when you look at the Old Testament, you see these strange little laws. I mean, there's some that are frightening, don't get me wrong. And he's telling them, act this way. He's saying, be holy. Be holy. Because I am holy. Be compassionate. Because I am compassionate. Do not oppress the poor. And sometimes, you know, it's not so much that we don't do those things. I think we do. I think you guys do them actually awfully well in a lot of ways. But if you're like me, sometimes you're not thinking. And you're not thinking of how you can honor God in that way. So who knows if that applies to you. Just try to wake up with God a little bit more on that issue. If not, okay. But you know, it's not about, geez, how can I make my life more comfortable? It's really not. Right? Even though I'm going to go home and watch a Packer game today. That's today, right?
Well, there is one.
Yeah. Probably going to do that. But it's really not about that. Yeah, there's a birthday party. I'm going to be there watching the Packer game. I don't know we're going to get to the Bears today.
Next Sunday.
Okay, I'll close with some prayer.